Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why scientists in different countries might approach science in totally different ways? Well, this new study dives deep into exactly that. So, the big idea behind this study is something called open science. You might have heard of it. It basically means sharing research more openly, like sharing your data, your code, and even your research plans before you start. The goal is to make science more trustworthy and less prone to mistakes. But here is the thing, while open science is becoming a big deal, most of the research about it comes from Western countries. What about places like China and Nigeria? How do researchers there feel about open science, and what is stopping them from doing it more? That's the question these researchers set out to answer. They surveyed over 370 researchers in China and Nigeria, two countries with very different research worlds. They wanted to see what researchers knew about open science, how they felt about it, if they planned to use it, what was getting in their way, and even their thoughts on some less than ideal research habits. And guess what they found? Generally, researchers in both countries knew about open science and liked the idea of it. But actually doing it, especially for the more time-consuming practices like registered reports or detailed pre-registration. Well, that was a different story. The roadblocks they hit were a mix of common issues and country-specific problems. Both groups mentioned a lack of training in open science, which makes total sense. But Chinese researchers felt more pressure from how their work is evaluated and the incentives they get, while Nigerian researchers struggled more with basic infrastructure, like having reliable internet and computers. Interestingly, many researchers admitted to or thought others engaged in questionable research practices. That is things like not reporting all the results or collecting more data after seeing the initial results. This study really highlights that just liking the idea of open science isn't enough. You need the resources, the training, and a system that supports it. So let's dive a bit deeper. The whole open science movement really kicked off to help fix what is called the replication crisis. This is when scientists try to repeat a study and it doesn't get the same results. That makes people question how reliable the original findings were. Open science practices like sharing data, code, and pre-registering studies are meant to make research more transparent and reproducible, helping to build trust back into science. Many big organizations and journals are pushing for these practices, and surveys have generally shown that researchers think they're a good idea. Now, how did they find all this out? They created a survey and sent it out to researchers in China and Nigeria. They used social media, email, and professional networks to get people to participate. They wanted to make sure the survey was understood correctly, so they translated it carefully into both Chinese and English. To make sure people were paying attention, they even included a little attention. Check question in the survey. After collecting the data, they did some careful cleaning to make sure only good quality responses were used. The survey itself was divided into 5 parts. The first part asked if people knew about different open science practices and if they had ever used them. The second part dug into their attitudes about these practices and if they intended to use them in the future. The third part asked about what barriers or challenges they faced in using open science. The fourth part looked at questionable research practices, asking how common they thought they were and if they themselves had ever engaged in them. Finally, the last part gathered demographic information. Let's get to the juicy findings. They ended up with nearly 200 researchers from China and about 170 from Nigeria. What's interesting is the group composition. For example, most Chinese respondents were in psychology, while Nigerian respondents were mostly in natural sciences. This difference actually tells us a bit about how they recruited participants and highlights the different research landscapes in each country. Overall, awareness of open science was pretty high in both countries, with over 90% knowing about at least one open science practice lifetime usage, meaning they tried at least one practice was also quite high, around 70% for both. But when you look at specific practices, things get more varied. In China, people were most aware of open data and open access publishing, and these were also the most used, less familiar with registered reports. For Nigeria, awareness was highest for open access and open data, but engagement was generally lower and more spread out, with replication studies seeing a bit more use than others. How did they learn about all this? Social media like X and WeChat was a big one in both countries, followed by lectures and conferences. Supervisors and fellow researchers also played a key role in sharing information about open science. Now, for attitudes and future plans. For the most part, researchers in both China and Nigeria had positive attitudes towards open science practices. They generally agreed that these things are good for science. However, when it came to their intentions to use them in the future, the enthusiasm cooled down a bit, especially for more demanding practices like registered reports or replication studies. Chinese respondents, while positive, showed lower future intentions for replication studies. Nigerian respondents showed a bit of hesitation, even neutrality when asked about their future use of pre-registration, open code, and preprints. This is where we see some key differences. For registered reports and replication studies, Chinese researchers who hadn't tried them before often saw them as too restrictive. Researchers who had tried them, however, sometimes cited difficulties getting published or lack of funding as barriers. For replication studies, common issues included not being able to access original data or methods and difficulty getting published. In Nigeria, registered reports faced common barriers like the long time it takes to publish and a lack of incentives. For replication studies, access to original data was a big issue, along with a lack of funding and publication challenges. Looking at open data and open code, Chinese respondents faced technical issues like storing and uploading large data sets for open data. For open code, they were more concerned about personal issues like time constraints, the complexity of the process, and doubts about the value of their code, also fear of criticism for flaws or misuse. Nigerian researchers also found the process for open code complex and time-consuming, with similar concerns about misuse and criticism. For open data, technical and infrastructural issues were prominent, like storage and uploading, but they also worried about the inappropriate use of data. Notably, many researchers in both countries checked "don't know how," pointing to a clear need for training. Moving on to preprints and open peer review. Chinese participants worried about the credibility of preprints and potential issues with research integrity, but less so about losing out on journal publications. For open peer review, worries focused on the objectivity of reviews, potential defamation, and the quality of reviews, with some differences in whether they worried more about authors or reviewers. Nigerian researchers, however, felt the barriers to preprints much more strongly, including low credibility, lack of institutional recognition, and not getting published in journals afterward. They also highlighted diverse barriers like copyright and supervisor disapproval. For open peer review, issues like biased feedback, review format, criticism, and long review times were common. Now, let's talk about questionable research practices, or QRPs. These are practices that aren't outright fraud but are considered bad scientific habits, like selectively reporting results or continuing data collection after seeing the initial findings. In both China and Nigeria, researchers believe these QRPs were quite common among their peers, though they tended to report doing them less themselves. This is a classic "it is not me, it is them" situation. Practices like continuing data collection after analysis and incomplete reporting of results were seen as the most widespread, while serious misconduct like faking data was perceived as rare. So what does all this mean? The study confirms what many others have found. Researchers generally like the idea of open science. They understand it is important for good science, but that positive attitude just doesn't always translate into action. The biggest barriers were consistently time, incentives, and a lack of knowledge or training. What's really interesting is how these barriers play out differently. In China, while there is top-down support for open science, researchers often feel their institutions still value traditional metrics like publication quantity and prestige more. Unless open science practices are recognized in these evaluation systems, they're seen as extra work with uncertain career benefits. This is especially tough for early career researchers who need to publish to get ahead. For Nigeria, the story is more about structural challenges. Despite a national interest in open science, there is a significant gap in essential infrastructure, like reliable internet, funding, and technical support. This makes it much harder to implement open science practices widely. Researchers also face pressures like the publish or perish mentality, high publication costs, and concerns about data privacy and cultural sensitivity, especially in health research. The study suggests that in China, the issue is more about integrating open science into research culture and policies, while in Nigeria, it is more about building the fundamental resources and infrastructure needed. The findings on questionable research practices also paint a concerning picture. The fact that researchers often see these practices as common, even among those who support open science, points to a bigger problem. The current systems that reward novel and statistically significant results can unintentionally encourage these shortcuts. This suggests a misalignment between scientific integrity values and the reward structures in academia. So, what can be done? The researchers suggest a two-pronged approach. First, addressing the big structural issues, improving research infrastructure, changing evaluation policies to recognize open science, and ensuring adequate funding. This is a long-term game, often requiring policy changes. Second, looking at what researchers can do within their current situations. This might mean finding ways to align open science practices with existing incentive systems, like developing open source tools that can be showcased in publications, or participating in big team science projects where open science is more integrated. They also point out that open science exists on a spectrum with low-cost options available, and that future surveys should perhaps explore the benefits of open science for researchers' careers more directly, not just the demands it places on them. Now, it is important to remember the limitations of this study. The sample sizes, while decent, are not huge and had some imbalances in disciplines, particularly in China, where recruitment was heavily influenced by existing open science communities. This means the results might be more positive than for the average researcher and are best viewed as contextualized snapshots rather than nationwide figures. Also, the survey was adapted from Western versions, which might not fully capture the unique challenges and opportunities in China and Nigeria. Future qualitative studies could really shine a light on these contexts. Specific aspects. In conclusion, researchers in China and Nigeria generally support open science, but the path to widespread adoption is paved with challenges. These include a lack of time, insufficient incentives, and missing knowledge. The study also sadly confirms that questionable research practices remain a concern. For open science to truly flourish, we need to look beyond just positive attitudes and address the practical, cultural, and infrastructural hurdles that researchers face, especially in regions often overlooked by global research surveys. It is really fascinating to see how researchers' environments shape their engagement with scientific practices, while both China and Nigeria have a growing interest in open science. The specific roadblocks are quite different. For China, it seems to be about institutional culture and recognizing open science in career advancement. For Nigeria, it is a more fundamental need for basic infrastructure and resources. This really drives home the point that open science isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. We need to think about how to make it work in diverse settings, considering local needs and possibilities. It also makes me think about how widespread these questionable research practices are globally, and how the pressure to publish regardless of the country can push researchers towards them. This study is a great step in understanding these differences and moving towards a more equitable and robust scientific future. What do you think about these findings? Are you a researcher? What are your biggest challenges when it comes to open science? Let me know down in the comments, and if you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a like and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more fascinating research insights. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.